we're currently in quite dire political circumstances. In that kind of a situation, there is a rush to deal with the very real situation facing us, and questions about where we want to be later on are kind of pushed back, or at least they have started. I mean, I've detected some discussions in the press about, you know, what do we want life to be like after this. So I guess in these kind of situations, what's the role for ideal theory, do you think?
Yeah, I've detected some of that too. And it's a great question about this project in particular, because of course, one of the big um, theses or claims of the book is sort of that we should resist the kind of widespread view that political theory always has to be practical, addressing practical problems and giving us guidance with what to do, which of course is extremely important. I'll say just briefly for people who aren't familiar what kind of the argument is why we should resist. And the very basic idea is that focusing on the value of justice, which is what I do, there's no strong argument out there that justice could turn out to be infeasible or impractical. It depends on what our best theory of justice is. And in particular, people could turn out to be such that now, or maybe even under the institutions that are being envisioned, they wouldn't comply sufficiently for those institutions to have their value. So that might not be the appropriate practical project, and we have to concede that. It may be that we have to concede that and build other institutions. But the theory of what justice is wouldn't be beholden to that. So that's why. But that doesn't yet answer your question, which is, okay, suppose you're even right about that. A completely separate question, which I do take up, but not as my primary thing, is, well, what value would it have to understand ideal justice? And now in a time like this, a really, really massive crisis where people are seeing, not that everybody agrees about what the cause is by any means, but people are seeing there must be fundamental flaws in the ways, just to put it generally, that we've organized ourselves. Now, at a time like that, this is one of the things I say in the book, not addressing coronavirus, of course. At a time when people are seeing that kind of thing, they may be open to thinking quite freely without being bound by how things actually are, about how things could be. And one answer to the question of what value it might have, to let the limits of your thinking not stop at what you think is likely or feasible and go beyond that and think that through too. One answer to that is we know from history that we've been wrong in thinking certain things were never going to happen or not feasible. Different people have their favorite examples. I'll just mention two connected ones. The abolition of slavery, from the time the abolition movement got started, I believe mostly in England, it was really much quicker than anybody would have expected that it was abolished, more or less. There's still continuing serious problems and so on. So that was fast. And a more recent related one, also about race in America, a lot of people can resonate with, is just a few years before Barack Obama was elected. Most people would have thought that's a long way off. So we don't know our own strength in a way. So don't limit yourself to what you think is feasible. You might be wrong. So last thing about this. So if political theorists were to think sort of outside the box as well as practical things, then in a time like this, when we want to look beyond the way things are and open our minds, we would have a fund of serious thought that's been worked out and debated over time, and that would be a great resource. I'm not saying we don't have any of that, but we're in a period now where there's at least a big strand of political theory that resists any idealistic, unrealistic thinking, and that's one argument about why there's value in doing so. Yeah.
But then the ideal non-ideal debate also makes its way into other bits of politics as well. I'm thinking about questions about democracy and questions about what are the appropriate epistemic standards for a representative chamber, for example. So people say, well, is it appropriate to just have a majority in a set of constituencies and go from there, or is it more important to have certain epistemic standards for diversity? So does that mean certain categories of people have to be represented, irrespective of whether or not they're voted for, and that sort of thing?
Right. Yeah, right. In democratic theory, I mean, the way I came to my interest in this topic of idealistic political theory was my own work on democracy in my book, democratic authority, as I was kind of finishing that project, I sort of faced the fact, which I knew, that that theory of political authority would only be satisfied if people behaved, very conscientiously, public spiritedly, and so on, in ways that I don't know if it's realistic or not. And I anticipated this criticism. And I came to think, if somebody were to say, but you and I both know people aren't going to do that, I came to think my response would be, but I never said they would do that. And I started to get clear in my own mind that it's a different kind of project. It's not about what people will do. Maybe we know for sure people will never do it. I'm asking what it would take for there to be political authority. I'm not saying people will do it. So anyway, that's a bit of a too quick answer. It doesn't settle it, but that's why I wrote a chapter at the end of that book, and that's how I got going. And you're referring, I think, to the fact that that theory was arguing for an epistemic dimension of democratic theory as being necessary, where many theories have tried to avoid that. Yeah, and I don't know how much of the following thing goes toward idealism and realism. You mentioned, suppose you want it to be epistemically, our political system to have epistemic value, whatever else it has. Does that militate in favor of some experts having more political power? Plato thought so. Why should the masses rule when they don't know what they're doing in politics? Or does it militate toward getting the diverse perspectives from all kinds of people, whether they're formally well-educated, whether they're literate, whether they're poor, whether they're incarcerated, and so on? I'm strongly in favor of the latter view. I think the epistemic prospects would be much better. So I don't know how much that has to do with idealistic theory.
I suppose because I thought that the argument for diversity is largely sort of evidence informed on the basis that you can better exchange information with a range of different perspectives rather than having them sort of informed by third parties, and so it feeds its way better into the non-ideal argument rather than the ideal one.
Tell me how you think that's non-ideal. Let me see if I'm getting it.
I suppose because it might not be the case if you just thought about democracy in sort of in pure ideal terms. You wouldn't necessarily think that relates to whether or not you need thresholds for X group being represented and Y group being represented and that sort of thing.
I see, because you might imagine a whole bunch of very well-informed and civic-minded participants.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's right, and that's of course a caution of this idea that we want, say, everybody involved for epistemic reasons, because of course, Jay Brennan has famously pushed this recently. Even if there's something to that, there's also the problem that, at least in principle, and there's some evidence that depending on how you want to measure a kind of competence, and that's a big question that we're after, it's not true that the whole diverse range of people are likely to have a positive contribution to make. So right, if we were imagining the philosopher king the way Plato did and went for epistemic value that way, that's a very idealistic conception. But if we're led to thinking that we want perspectives of, say, everyone for epistemic reasons, then we're not actually capitulating to kind of any realist constraint. So I see what you're saying, but in a way, we didn't get there that way. So I'm not conceding that we have to be realistic. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of your book, Utophobia, rests on you're creating a distinction between what you call can't do cases and won't do cases, and you have sort of several examples which help to sort of tease out that difference. My favorite one being Messy Bill, the guy who can't
you know him?
Trash out. I probably know one or two Messy Bills, yeah, certainly. And among your defense for it is sort of you've summarized it as this sort of people using ought implies can to overcome this distinction when actually that doesn't follow.
Yeah, that's right. So we might ask, what are some of the arguments people might give against doing political philosophy in ways that are highly idealistic, unrealistic? Here's one strand that I detect, kind of I'm distilling it a bit. Goes something like this. Nothing's required if it's impossible. If we can't do it, that isn't a requirement. And that's the ought implies can thing. And then they say, and now your theory purports to require these things that you admit nobody's ever going to do. But since ought implies can, those can't be real requirements. Now, I don't know if I did that in a way that you can pick up the once you think of it, obvious fallacy. The obvious fallacy was that argument proceeds as if what was granted in that second premise is that people can't do these things, but that wasn't what we should grant. What we should grant is that admit maybe they never will. Maybe we know for sure they never will. But aught implies can only kicks in if we've granted that they couldn't do it. That's a very different thing. Right, and so the can't won't thing is already present there. But then once you expose that very sort of crude version of that argument, the one that people are more willing to latch on, nobody's going to endorse that argument. But here's one more people are willing to endorse, where they'll say, well, you say that many of these things in these idealistic theories are things that people can do even if they won't, but we want to dispute what you count as what people can do. Because suppose the reason we know they won't is there are deep psychological traits of human beings, either permanent or as those traits would evolve under the institutions, it could be variable, such that when push comes to shove, they can't bring themselves to do it. And a phrase that gets used is it's psychologically impossible. It's a very important pivot phrase, right? It might look like, as I'm inclined to see it, a psychological motivational constraint. I mean, fact, maybe constraint, maybe not, about what they want to do. When push comes to shove, they don't really want to do it enough, but then they use the word psychologically impossible, which makes it sound like it might be a kind of inability. So I do talk quite a lot in the book about whether these cases we colloquially describe as things people can't bring themselves to do, and ask if those count as inabilities, and I argue that generally they don't. Now, of course, there are psychological sources of inabilities like phobias and addictions and things like that, or at least grant that those are inabilities, but those aren't what's at stake in these debates. It's usually self-interestedness and partiality and maybe laziness and so on. So what I argue is, even if I grant people can't bring themselves to be better than that, that doesn't show they can't be better than that. It might even be easy to be better than that. I'll give you one example I give all the time, just in case there's anybody left in this field who hasn't heard it. I'm sure there is. But it's a, I think, helpful thing just to see how something that we know a person's never going to do doesn't show that they can't, or even that it's difficult. And the example I give a lot is, I'm just not ever going to dance like a chicken in public. But dancing like a chicken in public is easy. You put your thumbs under it. I'm not going to do it. This is too public. So we can see that's dead easy, and I'm virtually guaranteed never to do it. Virtually certain I'm never going to do it. Suppose that what some idealistic theory requires of us is something that we know they're never going to do. We haven't shown that it's not within their abilities. We haven't even shown that it isn't dead easy. And I think actually, as it happens, Jerry Cohen and some others have written about, there's certain ways in which more egalitarian theories in particular, my book is not pushing for either any side in the ideological debates, but he says some of these idealistic theories, what they would depend on people doing aren't hard, but we just know people aren't going to do them because they're too selfish. It'd be easy to do them. They just don't, when push comes to shove, want to enough.
Yeah, it's sort of like when Cohen talks about his kidnapper argument and things like that for changing tax rates. But there's a part of me that's persuaded by the psychological case against this. And I guess it's partly informed by, among the people I've recently interviewed, which is Cass Sunstein, the nudge theorist. And when you start to read about nudge theory, you find quite illuminating how a small attenuation in a theory's understanding of psychology can make enormous sort of sweeping political differences. And so in the kind of individual examples you give, such as the kind of messy bill case, the distinction between can't do and won't do is quite plain, because who could possibly say of Bill, well, he's actually incapable of taking the trash out? That seems bizarre. But then when you start to look at sort of when you consider someone's life as a sort of continuous decision-making journey rather than a set of discrete, isolated choices, maybe that the distinction between can't do and won't do cases sort of collapse a little bit. I'm thinking of, for example, nudge theorists talk about how they've changed things like organ donation and pension schemes to default opt out rather than opt in.
Right.
And they find that actually that makes huge differences, despite the fact that everyone kind of assumes they're kind of in control of their own lives, and conceivably it has saved lives for people who wouldn't have organs donated to save their lives who now have, and people who would have been in pension poverty if these changes hadn't been made. And I suppose it's that kind of thing that actually in discrete cases, of course, everyone would say it's not the case that they can't join onto this pension scheme. It's that they haven't. But actually in people's sort of life journeys, pathways, if you like, they are bombarded with decisions, and there's only so many a choice they can make each day. And in that case, maybe we are starting to think about can't do rather than won't do.
I see. So let's see. Let me pull out two different points in that. One is the nudge thing specifically. I'll come back to that. And the other is this interesting point about, look, maybe I can resist telling a lie each time. Right? When I succumb and tell the lie, it's not that I couldn't resist. I mean, I couldn't. That's an ambiguous phrase. It's not that I couldn't tell the truth. It would have probably been just easy to utter those words and so on. But we might say it's psychologically impossible, by which you might grant that's just a motivational thing. You were tempted to benefit from a lie or something. And then we might say, is there a thing that we can formulate as all the cases where you'll have to choose whether to lie or not, and you're required to tell none of those lies? And then you might say, is that really a won't, or is that just a can't? I couldn't possibly do that. I think that's a good question, but I'm not sure there's a couple things to say about that. One is, we don't know for sure that if you set your mind to do that and never just gave in to temptation, that you wouldn't succeed. But if you fail because of giving in to temptation, that's just a won't. You didn't want to in the end. You hoped you would, you tried to get it started and so on. On the nudge thing now, I guess you might think the nudge thing reflects some inabilities, because you might think something like people can't bring themselves to do all these things that would be good for themselves and others, which just involve checking a box or whatever it is. We know they don't do it, and that's what the nudge data shows us. We also know that in many cases, they sort of wish they would, because they approve of what happened as a result of their not opting out. Do we really see any case of inability there for those agents? Or do we just see various kinds of weakness? I mean, certainly if we take some of the individual actions, like checking the organ donor thing on your driver's license, that's something I can do. And maybe so on for every one of these nudge things. And then we could go back to whether there's this big aggregate thing I can't do, and I said what I have to say about that. I don't know if you had this in mind, but we should notice that if you're the institutional designer, this fictional role that philosophers like to talk about, but if you're in there having an effect on whether we should have nudge-like policies, it is true that you can't maybe get people to do this thing that you'd like to get them to do unless you do that. So there's ability questions for the designer there. That is, I can get them to do it with the nudge policy. I can't get them to do it with the other. That doesn't transfer to showing I've tapped into something they can't do and made it the case that they can. I made it the case that.
Another kind of bit I was thinking about in terms of the can't do, won't do cases is that it allows you to do quite a lot more work than a non-ideal theorist can do. By which I mean, if it kind of gives you a lot more sort of political leeway in terms of theorizing. So I'm thinking of, it might be the case that there are certain situations which most people would intuitively regard as injustices, but because of this can't do, won't do distinction, it allows you to sort of cast those aside as, oh, well, they're just won't do cases. We don't need to sort of deal with them. So, a situation where there are a category of people in poverty or something like that, and someone says, well, these people can't help themselves. We need to sort themselves, to help them sort themselves out. Whereas you have the apparatus to be able to say, oh, well, these people just haven't been bothered. They need to help themselves out. And so I guess what I'm not trying to say there is present the standard charge against ideal theory by non-ideal theorists, which is just that they're not interested in real world injustices. And I don't think that accusation is warranted. So I mean, I think probably all political philosophers are interested in injustices of some sort or another. I suppose, I mean, more that it gives you this capacity to set aside a number of cases by using this can't do, won't do distinction, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
unwarranted.
I see the general idea, which we might put this way, and I take it this is part of what you're saying, is that even though this can't, won't thing comes up in the context of defending ideal theory, and by the way, I don't actually develop an ideal theory, I'm just talking about how justice could be ideal, and so ideal theories of justice aren't deficient on that ground. Like a lot of research that's not set out with a practical goal, you learn things that turn out to be valuable elsewhere. And I do think what I learned about the can't won't thing, let's just call it, and many other things in the book have all kinds of application, at least just to normative thinking generally, and not just in the areas I was applying it. A lot of stuff about how requirements work and things like that. And you're right, they could be applied in very non-ideal cases as well, absolutely. And I should say, of course, that there isn't an ideal theory, non-ideal theory debate in a way, because nobody defends ideal theory only. The ideal theorists, people who defend ideal theory, just defend the view that that's also okay. The people who are the sort of non-ideal theorists, they don't think it is, to simplify a bit. So I like to say that, my camp is the inclusive one, because that would be a good thing to be. Right. So I certainly think, and like Rawls said, the non-ideal theory is the urgent, pressing, practical stuff, of course. Then he went on to say why he thought doing ideal theory first, he seemed to say, is really important. Now, I don't embrace that first business. I do think, though, that doing both will be very important to doing the other. I suspect in the end that's what he thought. I don't know. That's a very Rawlsian methodology too. So probably didn't really mean for 100 years we'll just do ideal theory, and then once we got it, we can turn to
I was also thinking that the kind of psychological constraint sort of applies two ways, in the sense that in general you're talking about it in terms of standards of compliance with respect to some particular moral rule, but then there is also the sort of inverse way, which is that if a state is seeking some distributive outcomes, then it has to take into account psychological differences in order to achieve those distributive outcomes.
That's right. So that I make a distinction. I just give these words to this distinction, which I think I used before. There are important psychological facts about what people can bring themselves to do. We can dispute about whether those are inabilities, and that matters a lot for my project. But if you're, as it were, designing institutions, you have to take into account all the facts about what's likely to happen if you try to put these institutions in place, including these psychological facts. Even if they're just laziness or selfishness or whatever, if that's the predictable way and you don't see it changing, then you shouldn't build the institutions that would be good only if they behave differently from how you expect them. So nobody takes the view that you should build the institutions. Sometimes it's caricatured almost as if that's the implication, that we should build the institutions on the assumption that people are better. Nobody actually takes that view. Could see how people got there because, in some theories, Rawls, again, is a good example, the principles of justice are arrived at in a philosophical process where there is a role for the assumption in this hypothetical thought experiment that people are fully complying. He's not saying build the institutions that would be appropriate only if people fully complied, even though we know they won't. Right. So then if you're doing proposals and actually making institutions, you have to take full account of these things that people won't do.
And I guess the last question then, just following up from your point about Rawls, since you've said that Rawls kind of describes himself as this person who's interested in a realistic utopia, the lines between ideal and non-ideal theory aren't exactly incredibly distinct, and there's probably no philosopher who fits perfectly into one category. So how does the debate sort of manifest itself if these distinctions aren't so clear?
Right. I think that terminology has continued to be useful because we kind of know the family of issues we're talking about, and there's been a lot of interest in them recently, but it's not one issue. And there's been some good work, kind of like a meta study of work on ideal, non-ideal theory, showing that often they're debating different issues. So what's being called ideal theory is idealized in a different way than in some other debate. Sometimes it's about simplification. Sometimes it's about full compliance. Sometimes it's about moral perfection. a number of different things could go by the name ideal theory. So I never really formulated my project in terms of defending ideal theory. There is some reason for me to acknowledge that what I'm defending certainly is recognizable as on the ideal theory side of that divide in some important respects. But by no means am I defending everything that's gone by the name of ideal theory. So I wouldn't recommend getting rid of the terminology as long as it's used in a way that people should start to recognize this is talking about a number of issues that have certain similarities. Yeah, so I think that it can be problematic, and it was problematic in the literature for some time. I think less so now. I see people, especially who work in these areas, acknowledging that, and then they get more specific about which kind of idealization and which kind of realisticness.